Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This is meeting number 33 of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, Thursday, November 17th, 2016. And I will remind everyone that we are televised today, not only as committee members, but also to those in the audience. And so if you wouldn't mind muting or put your phone on vibrate or shut it right off. Otherwise, we have larger hammers than this to shut them off for you. I want to advise members of Parliament on our committee that the Auditor General has offered to provide this committee a special briefing between 10 o'clock and 10:45 on Tuesday, November 29th. And this would occur immediately following the lock-up session with all parliamentarians. And we thank him very much for that offer, and we have already extended the thank you, and we accepted the offer. So we should be prepared for that as well. Now today we are considering report number 3 of the spring 2016 report of the Auditor General of Canada. Report number 3 is an audit of the Governor and Council appointment process in administrative tribunals. We have a number of witnesses appearing before us today that are here to answer questions from our committee. From the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, we have Mr. Michael Ferguson, Auditor General of Canada, and Sharon Clark, Principal. From the Privy Council Office, we have Janine Sherman, Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet, Senior Personnel and Public Service Renewal, and Donalyn McClymonth, Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet, Senior Personnel Secretariat. Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, we have David Denduven, the Corporate Secretary, welcome, as well as Stephen Gagnon, Director General, Specific Claims Branch. Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, we have Jean Centra, Director General, Cabinet and Parliamentary Affairs and Executive Services Directorate. And from the Department of Industry, Shelley Dewar, Corporate Secretary, Office of the Corporate Secretary. So we'll begin this afternoon inviting our Auditor General for his comments, please. Welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, thank you for this opportunity to present the results of our audit on the Governor and Council appointment process. Joining me at the table is Sharon Clark, the principal responsible for the audit. In May of this year, we presented for tabling an audit report that examined the process used for Governor and Council appointments. This recruitment process is separate from the one that the Federal Public Service uses to appoint public servants. Work on this audit was completed in February 2016, and we've not audited actions taken since then. L'audit visait à déterminer si les ministères avaient.
The focus of this audit was to determine whether departments worked with the Privy Council Office to ensure that timely appointments of qualified individuals were being made to selected administrative tribunals to maintain continuity of service. We also assessed progress on some of the areas for improvement identified in our 2009 audit of the appointment process. These included the guidance provided by the Privy Council Office, the number and length of vacancies, and the notice given to appointees regarding their reappointments. In the recent audit, we focused on administrative tribunals that have a direct impact on Canadians. We looked at the roles played by the Privy Council Office, by selected administrative tribunals, and by the departments reporting to the ministers responsible for these tribunals. We did not audit the appointment decisions or the roles played by ministers, ministers' offices, or the Office of the Prime Minister.
Administrative tribunals regulate specific areas of the law or provide individuals with a way to appeal the government's decisions, such as those on immigration status or First Nations claims. Appointments to these tribunals must be timely to ensure that the tribunals can carry out their work. Appointees must also have the right background and experience to carry out their roles effectively. In our 2009 audit, we found a lack of guidance on the appointment process and lengthy delays in making some appointments to small entities and Crown corporations. We found that since that audit, the Privy Council Office has issued guidance and information to ministers, departments and tribunals on vacancies and on steps in the appointment process. However, this guidance was not accessible on the Privy Council Office website. The guidance also didn't address exceptions to the process, such as the appointment of judges to tribunals. We also found that many key positions weren't filled for long periods. These delays affected decision timelines for tribunals, which in turn affected individual Canadians and other stakeholders. For example, at the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada, the average time to process immigration appeals grew from 10 months, which we reported in our 2009 audit, to 18 months. Given the importance of the work that these tribunals perform, these delays and the resulting backlogs are concerning. Furthermore, we found that appointees weren't given sufficient notice of decisions on their reappointments. While this notice was more timely than what we reported in our 2009 audit, we found that it still didn't meet the requirement of 6 months' notice for reappointment of full-time appointees established by the Privy Council Office. Enfin, nous avons constaté que même si les processus
Finally, we found that while the selection processes for chairs and other full-time appointees were open and transparent, the part-time appointments that we looked at were not. Candidates for part-time positions were not evaluated against established criteria. In our view, without a documented assessment, it is not possible to demonstrate whether the process results in appointees with the necessary expertise and skills. The Privy Council Office has stated that making qualified appointments is key to the achievement of the government's objectives and the strengthening of accountability. We are pleased to report that the Privy Council Office and the departments and tribunals included in our audit agreed with our recommendations and committed to take corrective action. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. We would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
We'll now move to Ms. Sherman, please, for her opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And members of the committee, I am pleased to be here today to also discuss the findings of the report of the Auditor General on the Governor and Council appointment process for administrative tribunals. I think it would be helpful if I first take a few minutes to describe the appointments process, and I would also like to take this opportunity to update you on the government's new approach to Governor and Council appointments and how that approach relates to administrative tribunals in particular.
In terms of the process and how it works, let me begin by noting that Governor and Council appointments are made by the Governor-General on the advice of the Queen's Privy Council of Canada, as represented by Cabinet. Ministers actively manage all the GIC positions within their portfolios, and the Privy Council Office provides operational support and nonpartisan policy advice to the Prime Minister and to Cabinet Ministers. Appointments are made on the recommendation of the responsible minister to the GIC. It is the process leading to that ministerial recommendation that is established by the Prime Minister.
25th of 2016, the Prime Minister announced a new approach to Governor and Council appointments, which requires open, transparent, and merit-based selection processes that will support ministers in making recommendations on high-quality candidates who reflect Canada's diversity in terms of gender, linguistic, regional, employment equity, cultural, and ethnic representation. This approach applies to the majority of appointments to both full-time and part-time positions on commissions, boards, crown corporations, agencies, and tribunals across the country. And it is the inclusion of part-time positions within an open, transparent, and merit-based approach which is the most significant shift in how appointment processes are now managed. Le gouvernement nous a bien clairement fait savoir que la communication au
The government has made clear to us that communicating opportunities to Canadians is an important cornerstone of their open, transparent, and merit-based process. The Canada.ca website provides access to GIC appointments information and to the GIC appointments website where opportunities are advertised. In addition, appointment opportunities are advertised on the website of the organization filling the position and listed in the Canada Gazette while the application period is open. To build broader awareness, positions may also be advertised in other media. For example, social media, online, and in newspapers.
Candidates register and create an account for their GIC appointment applications on the GIC appointments website, where they will be able to apply to any of the opportunities that are listed. To support the government's objectives around diversity, applicants are asked to provide information on their second official language proficiency, and they are able to self-identify, if they wish, as members of an employment equity group, such as women, Indigenous peoples, visible minorities, and persons with disabilities in their online profiles. Candidates may also choose to self-identify as members of ethnic or cultural groups. Under the new approach, merit is being assessed through rigorous selection processes with selection criteria that is public. These qualifications and criteria reflect the organization's mandate, taking into account as well the minister's mandate and priorities established by the Prime Minister. Let me spend a few minutes on the sort of mechanics of the selection process. PCO manages or participates in all selection processes. In each case, a selection committee is established that reviews applications to ensure they meet the established criteria. The committee selects a short list of candidates for further assessment through interviews and written assessments as may be required. Candidates that the selection committee considers to be highly qualified for appointment also undergo formal reference checks to further assess personal suitability. The committee then presents formal advice to the minister on the most qualified candidates for consideration, and the minister then uses that selection committee's advice in finalizing his or her recommendation to the governor and council. Pour soutenir cette nouvelle approche,
To support this new approach, the Senior Personnel Secretariat at the Privy Council Office has been working closely with departmental contacts. Since the February announcement, we have undertaken a number of communication, outreach, and information sharing initiatives. We held information sessions in collaboration with the Prime Minister's Office to provide guidance, information, and tools to departments and organizations and all ministerial office staff involved in supporting their ministers on GIC appointments. We will continue to collaborate and discuss best practices with these key stakeholders.
Ministers' offices and portfolio departments and organizations have the information they need to support their ministers in making recommendations to fill current and upcoming vacancies. We have shared materials on our GIC appointments website for all stakeholders and will continue to share materials on both internal and external websites as we implement new policy guidance and direction over the coming months. This sharing of materials is well aligned with the recommendations in the Auditor General's report. L'échange d'informations a été crucial dans la transition vers la nouvelle approche en ce qui a trait aux nominations.
Information sharing has been paramount during the transition to the new approach to GIC appointments. An important area discussed with departments and agencies is exceptions to the new process, a point also raised by the Auditor General in his report. Given the government's commitment to open processes, the vast majority of positions will normally be subject to a formal, advertised selection process. Exceptions need to be made for positions with requirements found in the legislation that establishes certain organizations. For instance, legislation may specify a GIC appointment must be a sitting judge or a person nominated by a third party, such as a provincial or territorial government, a First Nation, or a user or other stakeholder group. We are not seeing many of these exceptions, and when they do arise, PCO works closely with its partners to identify and verify the exceptions on a case-by-case basis.
During implementation of the new process, the government has decided to make appointments or reappointments to positions that are essential for the good governance or continuity of government business that may not include the full set of these new measures that were announced earlier this year. As these are transitional situations, such appointments or reappointments are generally for 1 year or less, subject to any legislative provisions. But this transitional measure helps to ensure that organizations can continue to function and that services continue to be delivered to Canadians without interruption. As I've noted, the changes to the appointments process are intended to contribute to the recommendation of high-quality candidates with a goal of better reflecting Canada's diversity. And they also align with the recommendations from the Auditor General's report on the Governor and Council appointment process for administrative tribunals. The objective of the Auditor General's report, as my colleague has noted, was to determine if timely appointments of qualified individuals were being made to selected administrative tribunals to maintain the continuity of service to Canadians. My colleagues from other departments are here to answer questions related to specific recommendations made regarding the specific administrative tribunals that were examined. But I would like to take just a few more minutes to provide some context for their remarks by setting out a general overview of selection processes for admin tribunals. Comme c'est le cas de toutes les nominations par le gouverneur.
As with all GIC appointments, with few exceptions, opportunities for positions in administrative tribunals are advertised publicly, and candidates are invited to apply online. The exceptions are in the case of positions that need to be filled by sitting judges. PCO works with the Administrative Tribunal and Portfolio Department to apply the spirit and intent of the new approach to help ensure we meet the government's commitment to diversity. All selection processes for administrative tribunals follow the kinds of established selection processes that I mentioned earlier.
With 4 large administrative tribunals to implement measures to support enhanced consistency in the approaches undertaken to assess candidates for these very important decision-making positions. We intend to use the lessons learned and best practices from the large tribunals to identify ways that the efficiency and timeliness of selection processes for positions in the smaller administrative tribunals can be implemented. Implementing this new approach has required capacity building within the Privy Council office and within the departments and organizations that are responsible for supporting GIC appointments. We very much appreciate the advice of the Auditor General to help ensure the ongoing improvement of the overall appointment system, and we are committed to continuing to act on the Auditor General's recommendations as we work closely with partners to implement the government's approach to GIC appointments in administrative tribunals and other organizations across government. In closing, as it is implemented, this new approach to GIC appointments is key to providing Canadians with an opportunity to be considered to serve in our democratic institutions that are fundamental to the decisions and programs that directly impact individual Canadians. I would be pleased to not take any questions you have on the appointment process.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sherman, and we'll now move to the first round of questioning, and that goes to the government side and to Mr. Lefebvre. Vous avez 7 minutes.
Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Madame Mendez.
You have 7 minutes. Thank you very much for your presentation. As a lawyer, as an officer of the Crown, I'm really upset by the delays it takes in filling these positions. You've come here and I see you talk about your new system rather than the old system. But the 2010 audit goes from 2010 to 2015. you talked about what happened with the new system that's come in since February 2016. But when I look at the tribunals, where there are not enough judges in the positions, and people want to have justice served, and that has a tremendous impact. One case in particular that I find quite terrible, I don't want to go into specifics really, but the recommendations, well, you explain them to some extent. You say that the ministers, on the advice of the Privy Council, is presented to the Cabinet. The decisions are made by the Governor-General on the advice of the Privy Council of the Queen. You talked about the Cabinet. The ministers actively manage the appointment process within their portfolio, and you provide operational support and strategic advice that's nonpartisan. So you're making recommendations to the ministers, and the minister decides. Is that correct? Thank you. In the case of the specific claims tribunal,
members must be Superior Court judges. A 2014 analysis indicated that it required one additional full-time member and a sufficient number of part-time members to bring the number up to 4 full-time equivalents. So there's a need. That's my quote. Despite this need, which was confirmed by the Department of Justice Canada, no appointment was made to the tribunal between 2012 and the end of our audit period, so 3 years. After the audit period, tribunal officials told us that this need had increased to 6 judicial members. A shortage of appointees at this tribunal means further delays in addressing First Nations claims in a timely manner. Tribunal officials told us they had to inform interested parties that the tribunal could not confirm hearing dates due to the lack of available judges. Did you provide recommendations of judges to fill these positions?
I also from the department, perhaps after Ms. Sherman, if you would want to.
Yep.
Recommendations made.
I will, I mean, there is a process in terms of appointing judges, which, as the Auditor General noted, is slightly different in that it requires the agreement with the judiciary. There's a process by which the Minister of Justice will work with judicial affairs in terms of making sure there are people available that are suitable for the positions. And that is the process that we support in terms of making those recommendations. I would ask perhaps my colleagues to speak specifically in response to the case for that tribunal.
Yes.
Alors, le tribunal comme tel.
The tribunal, in the case of the tribunal, we're not involved with the appointment of judges to the tribunal. What we do is that we look at the website of the Privy Council office, and we look at all the appointments that are made, and we noticed in May that there are 3 appointments that have been made. But, sir, just from 2010 to 2015, the Auditor General said that there was a demand, there was a real urgent need for this tribunal, and that no appointments were made. So I'd like to know. You say it's not you, I understand. Who's responsible for making the recommendation? I thought it was the Privy Council office. Who for the Queen? Who does this?
That it is, and you're correct, I have described the improvements in the process that have been made recently. Under the previous process, the process for appointing judges to GIC positions is the same in the sense that it requires the Minister of Justice to work with the judiciary and develop a list or a roster of judges that are available for those appointments.
Okay.
So,
I guess I'll read my question again. Was there a list made or not?
well, I was going to say where the list and so the process in terms of those appointments that is different now. There was not a list made by a selection committee at that time. It was a process that is managed through the Department of Justice with the Minister of Justice and Judicial Affairs. So I'm
so why
not in a
not?
position.
My question is why not? I'm just
Yeah.
again, this is not normal. This is not acceptable that we have First Nations claims that are not being addressed because somebody's not naming somebody to it, and nobody wants to say, from what I'm hearing here, that you guys are passing the buck. Basically, you're saying, we don't know who appoints us. Yes, you do know who appoints us.
We do know.
As I'm asking, was there or was there not a recommendation made of somebody that could sit on this tribunal?
Well, I'm not in a position to
So who is
provide
then, if you're
information
not-
on whether the recommendations were made.
Why not?
Because those are public service is there to support as I've mentioned, the process for appointments. In this case, these are appointments that are managed through a negotiation and a discussion with the judiciary and the Minister of Justice. And PCO, in our role, does not support that process.
Well, I'm sorry. I rarely get upset. I rarely get upset, and the chair knows this. This is not acceptable at all. Thank you. Yes, I guess I'm replacing Mr. Christopherson today. Because, again, seeing that there is a crying need and telling, again, they told us they had to inform interested parties that the tribunal could not inform hearing dates due to the lack of available judges, and you're telling me we're not sure who names these judges. Well, you know who does, but you can't tell us if it was done or not.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lefebvre, and I don't want to chance you getting upset with me, but your time is now up. So we'll now move to Mr. McColman. Perhaps we can come back to an answer there a little later. Mr. McColman.
Well, thank you all for being here today to let us drill down into your findings. To the Auditor General, as you presented and we listened to your comments at the start of this, and I've underlined and highlighted a few of them, I would consider it quite damning if this were my organization you were bringing this report to. Do you view it in that fashion?
When we did this audit, and again, we had done a similar audit in 2009. In 2009, we'd found a number of problems, and we felt that the problems with the appointments was actually affecting service to Canadians. So when we came back and we looked at this again, we put that specific lens on it. Looking at some of the tribunals where they make important decisions, whether it's on, refugee files or, the competition or the specific claims or the ones that we looked at were focusing in on organizations that make important decisions for Canadians on questions that Canadians need resolved. So I think fundamentally, what we're looking for, and at the time we noticed that there was an improvement in process. There was more guidance provided by Privy Council Office. There were more notifications issued by Privy Council Office. But I think fundamentally what we're looking for in this whole area is it's important to make sure that these positions are filled because of the decisions that have to be made. So for us, the final result on this, and we've made recommendations, the final result on this is going to be less about process and what changes have been made to process, and it's going to be much more about, are there fewer vacancies, are vacancies being filled faster? So I think fundamentally, yes, we were disappointed that we found that the results were very similar to what we had found in 2009, and really what we're looking for going forward, is indications that there are fewer vacancies and vacancies are being filled faster.
Well, anecdotally, I do have some experience on a couple of these administrative boards, and just through individuals who applied, and I can say this, that it totally verifies what you're saying, which is there's seemingly some kind of a barrier or something in the selection process, or perhaps it's a lack of qualified individuals who put their names forward for these positions, and it turns into being absolutely dysfunctional in terms of the operation of some of these organizations, and it leads to things like untimely parole board hearings, and parole board hearings sometimes that don't even happen, and other types of things that can greatly affect Canadians. So maybe I'll move to Madam Sherman and say to you, you've watched this, you've been at the heart of it. Can you share with us specifics in terms of what these barriers may have been?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that there's a number of things, I think, to first note that we do spend a lot of effort in terms of managing, providing information to ministers and to departments about vacancies so that they can be effectively managed. This means, we will look at vacancy reports with some forward dating so that departments are aware and can prepare in terms of future vacancies upcoming. There are, I cannot speak to the specific situation in, one or more of the administrative tribunals over time. But there are often, there are posted vacancies. We usually have very good uptake in terms of candidacies. And there may be regional or locational differences, potentially. Sometimes there are specific locations that need to be filled, and those positions there may not be candidates there. But that is, I'm not saying that is the case in the parole board, but that is one thing that might be a factor. But we do work very assiduously to make sure that, and that is something that I think we have learned in terms of the Auditor General's report, that it does require a lot of information being available, and the more attention we pay to future vacancies and the more attention we pay to timely processes, then we can avoid those situations where there are vacancies. One other point I would note is that sometimes, and which may show up on our website, because there would be vacancies listed there that are potential positions on particular tribunals or organizations, and the organization itself may feel that those are not necessary to fill at that point in time, given caseload demands or whatever their operational requirements are. So there may sometimes be cases like that.
Does it, I don't know whether you can comment on this. If I'm overstepping a line here, obviously, Chair, I would like to be told. But does this bog down when it gets to the political level, the political process, the minister's office, their desires in terms of what they want to see happen and what it is that you're providing them?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think I'm in a position to speak to the political process. My job in terms of senior personnel and the GIC appointments process is really doing, as I mentioned, the operational support and some of the advice. There may be reasons or considerations on the political side, but I'm not really party to that or can speak to that.
What happens on these administrative boards? I can think of one, and I will not mention it, that I'm aware that they don't even have quorum to make decisions. What happens in those situations? Does someone ring an alarm bell within your organization and say, we've got to get the complete dysfunction fixed soon, quick, and there's a hurry-up process?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's a very important point, and that is part of the information that we seek to share and provide with departments. Departments and ministers' offices are also responsible for managing, as I said, the appointments in a minister's portfolio. But yes, we do, and that is part of how we would triage or prioritize selection processes in terms of making sure they get launched in a timely way. If quorum, there may be a situation where a member resigns, or sometimes there may be a death, and if an organization is very close to, a quorum, if that one or two vacancy makes a difference in being able to meet quorum, those are situations that are, raised in terms of an alert is given, and there can be temporary measures to make sure quorum is maintained while a selection process may in fact already be underway or gets launched.
Thank you, Ms. Sherman, and we'll now move to Mr. Weir.
Thanks very much
7 minutes
for
and welcome. Welcome to our
yeah,
committee.
thanks for having me at the Public Accounts Committee. I was pleased that Mr. Lefebvre was so animated in his comments, because I'm not sure I'll be able to live up to Mr. Christopherson's usual standard in that regard. My first question would be to the Auditor General. I wonder, in terms of the appointment process for administrative tribunals, whether things have gotten better or worse since 2009.
Well, again, I think what we identified in the course of the report was that there had been some changes done. There was more guidance provided to the departments. There were more information sessions provided to departments. There was information about upcoming vacancies provided. So, you know, at least certainly in terms of some of the things that Privy Council Office had said that they were going to do in response to our 2009 audit, some of those things were in fact done. And I know that in terms of the 4 tribunals that we looked at, not every one of those appointments was appointments that were handled through the Privy Council Office, but our concern was, you know, we still were seeing delays and impacts. I think we talked specifically about the Immigration and Refugee Board, where in fact the delays had gotten worse, moved from 10 months to 18 months. And again, I know the Privy Council Office isn't involved in all of those, but you know, so it's one of those situations, and it's concerning in terms of the audits that we produce, is that sometimes there can in fact be improvements in process without having improvements in results. So I think that's really what's important to focus on in this whole file, is not just the process, and yeah, making more improvements to the process will hopefully get us there, but there needs to really be more focus on, you know, how many vacancies are filled, how quickly are they filled, and what's the results, and can these organizations operate with the number of members they need to make the decisions they have to make.
So would it be fair to say overall there has been an improvement in the process, but not necessarily in the results?
Well, again, it wasn't a direct one-to-one comparison, you know, the organizations we looked at in 2009 to the organizations that we looked at in this most recent audit. Certainly, again, I can say that there were things done to the process that made improvements, particularly in providing information to departments about upcoming vacancies. But I think I would have to say that overall we were disappointed with you know, the extent of the vacancies that still existed and the impact that those were having on some very important decisions.
Thank you. Now, I did want to ask Ms. Sherman a little bit about the new website for appointments. And I wonder, is this a website that's well promoted and that job seekers and prospective applicants would know to make a submission on?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I think it is. I mean, it's certainly, you know, if you Google appointments, you'll land there. But more importantly, it is also accessible through the Canada.ca webpage, which is where all sort of government traffic is directed. So I think it is fairly visible and available, and we certainly, you know, do work to make sure that it stays that way.
Does it happen that the government decides it wants to appoint someone and then encourages them to submit through the website, or does someone have to have put in their submission through the website on their own initiative in order to be considered in the first place?
Well, Mr. Chair, I think I would note that we obviously would not see how, you know, what the impetus for that application was. We see through the website the individual's application. So whether they've been encouraged to apply, it always comes from the individual. And they do create a user profile. So we know that it is that person, I think, that is applying.
Okay. And you mentioned in terms of the new process, merit and diversity as being objectives. Do you see a trade-off between those goals?
Thank you. No, I think that the merit is the baseline. So open and transparent and merit-based are the fundamental elements of how the selection process is structured. Diversity is equally important, but it follows on merit. So merit is always the sort of baseline for measuring an applicant's qualifications, and the diversity information is helpful in terms of potentially making choices, but those are elements that each one of the qualified candidates would meet the merit criteria.
So just to understand the mechanics of the process, someone would need to meet a certain baseline in terms of merit, and then after that, appointments might be decided based on the diversity criteria?
Well, again, Mr. Chair, I would note that it is ministers who make those choices. We provide them with information, and the first level of information that we do going through the selection process is the assessment against all those selection criteria, which is education, experience, knowledge, past experience, personal suitability, and attached to all of that is diversity information on those qualified candidates.
Okay, so essentially you're turning that information over to the ministers, and they're making the ultimate assessment of what's most important and who to appoint.
That's correct.
Okay. If you wanted to finish up that answer you didn't quite have a chance to give when you were cut off, feel free to use a minute for that.
I think that went back to Mr. Lefebvre's question,
Yeah.
which dealt with the lists. Are there lists being submitted,
Right.
being readied,
Right.
and is there access to those lists?
Right. So I think what I wanted to, that is part of the process, and that is something that we have provided greater clarity and guidance to departments in terms of how judges are appointed to GIC positions. Whether there are currently lists available, I'm not in a position to say that. That is something that is worked out through the Minister of Justice and the judiciary, and so there may be ongoing negotiations at any point in time to develop, and that is one of the things that will help us be better prepared to develop rosters of judges that that are suitable for some of these governor and council appointment positions. But I cannot speak to the specific case where you've asked if there was a recommendation made. That would be, if there was a recommendation, it would be a cabinet confidence. I can tell you there were not appointments made in the time period that you were referencing.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Sherman. We'll now move to Ms. Mendez.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais continuer.
Thank you. I will go back to what my colleague was saying. I'd like to ask Ms. Clark a question. You were in charge of the audit, if I understood correctly. I'd like to ask you, what was the real problem? What was the obstacle that led to this difficulty in putting forward names of judges who were suitable for the tribunal, such as a specific claims tribunal? I think it's a very important tribunal for the First Nations. There seems to be a recruitment problem that is acting as a barrier to making recommendations. Thank you very much for your question. There are a lot of stakeholders, as you can see. There's a Minister of Justice, the Department of Justice, the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, the Privy Council Office. There's a different process for judges, as we explained in the report. It's not exactly the same process. And you have fewer judges, you have fewer names of people who are suitable. Yes, it has to be a Superior Court judge. Are there any language criteria, or do they have to have people who are Aboriginal? Yeah, there are always other criteria, but I could perhaps refer you to Mr. Gagnon. Yes, if you would like to complete the answer.
The role that I play is my group is in charge of the assessment of claims and the negotiation of claims in the event that we don't accept a claim for negotiation, or we have been negotiating for more than 3 years. The First Nation has an option to go to the tribunal. I can only tell you what I think I know about the appointments, because we're not involved in the selection of judges or recommendations, and I think that's by design, because
there was a concern when the reforms were brought into place that the department used to be the group that negotiated the claims, and then there was no independent place somebody could go to get them. So in terms of I mean, I can tell you what I think I know about the judges, and generally speaking, the diversity in our for would-be judges familiar with certain case law in certain regions. For example, the chair is from British Columbia. We have a large number of claims, both in negotiation and proportionally at the tribunal, that are from British Columbia. So I think they try and do that so that you've got judges from various superior courts across the Canada, so they wouldn't all be from Ontario per se, or Quebec or British Columbia. So I think that's how they do it.
But do you agree that we have a disproportionate number of judges lacking in the tribunal, and that it seems to be a pretty recurring problem?
Again, it's a tough thing for me to express. I know that the chair of the tribunal himself has said that a number of times in his annual reports. Those are public documents, so I know from time to time he's expressed that view. But my role at the tribunal is quite separate.
Mr. Chair, through you to the Auditor General, I mean, how can we make a recommendation to improve this, or where does it come from?
So I think you know, when you look at the components of this, it starts with the appointments have to be Superior Court judges. So you're starting with a very small pool of possible appointments, and you have a number of these different tribunals that need to draw from that pool. And that's why there's the conversation between you know, the Department of Justice and the judiciary to sort that out. So I think really to get to the bottom of this, you know, and we very much did identify that with the specific claims tribunal, that there was a shortage of members for the tribunal to be able to make its decision. So unfortunately, it seems like everything is focused on sort of the end of the process. What I mean by that is, you know, when there's a vacancy, and maybe I have this wrong, but it's certainly the way that I perceive it, when there's a vacancy, you know, there's this process to try and identify who might we be able to pull out of the sitting judges to sit on a tribunal. Whereas I think it sounds much more like a classic case of sort of succession planning, and when judges are appointed in the first place, having a bit of an idea of, you know, when there might be vacancies on some tribunals, which judges might be the pool that can draw from, and have I think it's the area where there really has to be a lot more forward thinking in terms of, okay, it's not just about who's getting appointed to the courts, it's also who's going to be able to fill these tribunal positions, because otherwise we can't make decisions on things like First Nation specific claims.
5 or 10 years ahead of time,
Right.
Who will need to be. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll move back to Mr. Godin. Mr. Godin, we're in the second round now, a 5-minute round.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci de vous.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for coming here. Unfortunately, Mr. Ferguson, Auditor General of Canada, you will probably understand where I'm coming from. This applies to many departments, and before I go back to my usual comment, I'd like to say that I'm happy to see you point out that there has been an improvement in the process in what happened before 2009, and then there was a report of 2009, and then there was another report done in 2015. So we see a portrait of what occurred in these 15 years. There has been some improvement, unfortunately, and this is where I go back to my usual point, and it doesn't pertain to you per se, but the various organizations, unfortunately, always wait for an audit before they take action. The Auditor General, in his opening statement, said that the various organizations accept the recommendations. I think he says that in every report. Organizations always accept the recommendations. So, why do we have to wait for the Auditor General to come to the department before we implement measures to improve systems? In your organizations, is there any type of annual self-assessment tool so that we don't have to wait for an Auditor General to step in, because the problem for taxpayers is that if you're lucky enough to get in the mix with the Auditor General, well, it takes 20 years for someone to self-identify or self-improve and do something. So why don't we have some kind of self-assessment tool? And if there is one, could you please talk to us about it?
I take your point. The reports of an Auditor General are always very focused in terms of giving us recommendations of a specific nature in terms of that particular audit. I do think that there are ongoing improvements beyond the timing of those reports. Certainly in 2009, there were significant deficiencies found, and those were addressed. And they have continued to be addressed and improved over the time period. Certainly in terms of the role that the Privy Council Office plays in providing guidance and information, and supporting ministers and departments with information about vacancies and the timeliness and of making appointments. So I hear you. I do think that there are several opportunities throughout our work in departments where we look for ways to improve. We do have internal audit processes in departments. We have our annual performance reports. And so I think those are opportunities where we also take stock of what we have spent in terms of taxpayer dollars on particular activities and what the results are. And we do seek to improve and find efficiencies in the way we do our work and what the results are as well. There are sometimes delays, and there are sometimes things that don't get done as quickly as we would like. But in terms of the appointment process, I think that the Auditor General's findings had certainly confirmed for us certain things that we were trying already to do better in terms of the full-time and leadership positions under the previous approach that were our responsibility. And that's why, for example, I think when they conducted the audit, they'd found very fulsome and files and documentation about how we were supporting the process. So that's something that was happening in between the audit times. So I think it is something that, as public servants, we are always concerned about how taxpayer dollars are spent and looking to find efficiencies and improvements.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais y aller rapidement. En fait, j'apprécie.
Briefly, Mr. Chair, I appreciate the fact that your department is paying closer attention to these matters. I'd like to hear from the other departments, because there are various levels involved. So if there's a problem noted at the start, it has a domino effect on the rest of the situation.
Unfortunately, again, we are out of time. We'll now move over to Mr. Chen, please. Mr. Chen, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to hone in on the Auditor General's report, and specifically his examination of the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. As is stated in the report, it says here under section 3.39 on page 9 that the Immigration Refugee Board changed the appeals process last year to address the backlog of cases. But I want to start off first by stressing how important it is that we have timely processing of these cases. I know within my own constituency, I've met many residents, and I met one lady, for example, who is trying to have her husband sponsored so that he could be with her and the family in Canada. And they've waited from the point of filing the application, having it rejected, and then waiting for an appeal over 2 years. And it's very stressful for families to have to wait that long. It's not good for the children. And I really empathize with constituents that have come to my office and spoken to me about cases such as this. It's actually quite heartbreaking sometimes to hear their stories and hear about the struggles they face without having the family united. And this is not unique. These cases, as identified through the report, are part of the 11,000 outstanding immigration appeals, and each of these cases taking, on average at this point, 18 months to process, which is almost double of the time it took 10 months in 2009, as reported in the audit at that point. But the point I really want to underscore is the importance of having that fair appeals process. And I believe as Canadians, it's very important for us as a country, not just for the appellants and their families to have that timely appeal, but for all of us to know that there's a process there that is fair and thorough. So with respect to the comment here under section 3.39, I'm concerned because first, this might be perhaps outside the scope of the Auditor General's report, but I'm concerned that this backlog is simply being addressed by changing the appeals process, as noted in the Auditor General's report. And I'm wondering if the Auditor General could comment on any further insights that might have been gathered with respect to this issue. I understand that there is a process of appeals. Sure, there are a number of appointees. So to me, it's not just a matter of ensuring those appointees are filled. If the process is being changed to address a lack of appointees, that to me is concerning. If the number of appointees is insufficient to address the backlog, then perhaps there needs to be a greater number of appointees made. I'd like the Auditor General to perhaps comment on this issue here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll just sort of lead in, and then I'll pass it to Ms. Clark. But I think, as far as we can comment is the period of time, when we were actually doing the audit, the period of time under the audit. And I think, as we said in paragraph 38, we identified that there was this backlog, and the time to process the backlog had moved from 10 months to 18 months. So, things weren't getting better at that point in time. But in paragraph 39, we also identified that they did start to make some changes, and that started to reduce a little bit the backlog. What's happened since then, I'm not really sure. So I'll ask Ms. Clark if she has sort of any other information that can help you understand what was going on at that point in time. But sort of what's happened since that point of time would be something that the Immigration and Refugee Board, I guess, would probably have to respond to.
So I'll just talk a little bit about the process at the IRB. It's a different process. They do their own recruitment, doesn't go through PCO. They have a very high number of GIC appointees. That number is lower than it was in 2009 when we did our audit, because they changed some of those positions so that they're now public servant positions. So they go through a different process and don't go through the GIC process. So as part of that transition, there was sort of a movement from the GIC appointees who had started with a given file were asked to complete those files and not have someone new suddenly take on new files. So they made the decision to sort of carry a bigger backlog during that period. We talk about it in the report because it's important and it has very real impacts, as was mentioned. So we wanted to bring attention to the impact of not filling all those positions in a timely manner and carrying that backlog and what the impact is. So I think we're getting that message across. We did have a lot of meetings with the IRB at which they told us they were cognizant of this and they were taking action.
Thank you, Mr. Chen. We'll move to Mr. Godin. Mr. Godin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais revenir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to go back to the question I asked earlier. But in the meantime, Mrs. Sherman, you said that there were appointments that have been delayed or have not been made, and that it could be justified by the fact that there's a lack of staff. My question is for you. There are two ways of appointing policy. If the policy is that we're going to put it aside and we're going to delay, but then there's also the internal side to things as well. These precious government officials, I'll call them that, if they don't have the staff, if they are overworked, if they don't have the tools, perhaps they shouldn't make appointments. So the message is not being conveyed. It doesn't get to the decision makers, and so that they begin the whole appointment process. I don't know if you understand where I'm coming from, but in the department, amongst the officials, is the problem lie with the officials, or is it the politics or policy, so that Canadians don't get access to services as quickly as they should?
I think I would like to clarify, I may have, in terms of the delays and staff requirements, my remarks, and if it's, when I made my remarks, it was about building capacity in terms of the new approach, which has expanded the open, transparent, and merit-based process to a much broader range of appointments. So it is not, I'm not trying to imply that there are not sufficient resources. It's simply that we have been adapting to the implementation of the new policy approach and supplementing the resources that we have in order to deal with a bigger volume. So that's, I'd just like to clarify that. And then in terms of delays, I mean, I think that there are two sides to the appointments process. The Privy Council office and departments that support ministers do indeed have to do their work and work through selection processes and provide that advice and information to ministers. I think it's fair to say that the more formal the process is, the longer it will take. Obviously, having an application process and going through the steps that a merit-based approach takes does take some time. But what we are working to do is actually look at the whole range of appointments, do some forward planning, and make sure that we are setting up the system so that we can provide that advice and information on a timely basis, which will then enable ministers in their responsibilities for making recommendations to do that on a timely basis. So, it's a lot of project planning, absolutely. I think that both sides, in terms of the public service and the political responsibilities, have to work in sync and have to follow some important timelines. That's what we're trying to do in terms of some of the process improvements that we've spoken about. I hope that answers your question.
So what you're telling me is that since you have been using this new approach, you now have the tools, and so that the process will be accelerated? Is that what I hear you saying? That was my question.
I think that we have the tools in place through the online application process, through the, some clarity in terms of how the process will apply to all of the positions in order to do our work efficiently. I do not think it necessarily will accelerate any single process, but we are working with providing more information more broadly to our colleagues and other stakeholders to make sure that we are tracking the vacancies and planning ahead so that we don't we don't end up with long-term vacancies.
Quickly. Pourquoi, Madame Sherman?
Mrs. Sherman, why did you say that this would not accelerate the appointment process? Thank you.
I said it would not accelerate the appointment process because we are taking the merit-based selection process and applying that to a broader base of appointments. And so in doing that, as we are through this transitional time of implementing the new policy approach, we are learning as we go. We are taking lessons learned and applying them. But the fact is that we are applying the selection process to a much higher volume of appointments. So it isn't that it necessarily will accelerate that process, but it will apply rigor, and with the appropriate planning and sort of prioritizing of which appointments need to be made to fill vacancies, we will be able to keep pace with appointments and do them on a timely basis.
Thank you, Ms. Sherman. We'll now move to Mr. Area, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairman, in your presentation, page 2, last line, you mentioned to support government's objectives around diversity, applicants are asked to provide information on their second language proficiency. But if you ask me, the moment you ask for second language proficiency, you're cutting out large section of Canadians, especially the new Canadians and ethnic minorities. The bilingual requirements I can understand. I understand that we have to support bilingualism, but when there is no requirement, also, you try to ask, hey, do you know the second language? When that question is asked, trust me, lots and lots of Canadians who are otherwise very highly qualified will not even apply. There are many millions and millions of unilingual Canadians who are qualified. They are not eligible many a times because of the requirement. Though eligible, just because you ask whether do you know the second language, they will not apply. And especially this is more true among the new Canadians and the ethnic minorities. So I think that you are wrong, that in the name of diversity, you are asking for second language requirements. In fact, you are dampening the people with limited language capacity to apply.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that view. That's important consideration. There are only a few governor and council appointments which have a statutory requirement for bilingualism. Those are primarily the agents of Parliament. And bilingualism is something that is obviously a preference. It's always good to have bilingual candidates, but it is not, while we do ask for it in the user profile, I do believe that applicants will be looking through when they apply for a position, they will be looking through the selection criteria that a particular position requires.
What happens is that when there's a requirement, I understand. I have no issues there. But even when there is no requirement for the position that the applicant has to be bilingual, the moment you ask, do you know the official second language, it dampens.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Ms. Sherman.
Thank you. That is something, and we can certainly, monitor that in terms of, whether we are getting a high number of applicants for particular positions. It is information. It is not intended, and I take your point that this is, this may have an effect on people's willingness to put themselves forward, but it is something that it doesn't say you have to be bilingual. It will tell you, it asks for a level of proficiency.
I understand. I can certainly tell you, I know many others. The moment you say, do you know the second language, we know, okay, here it goes again, we will not be looked into. So that is the thing. Coming to your page 5, last para, you said the changes to the appointment process are intended to contribute to the recommendation of high quality candidates with a goal of better reflecting Canada's diversity. How do you measure it? Whether the appointments are leading towards that?
Area, Ms. Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very good question. I think that one of the ways we can look at that is certainly the data that we are collecting on applicants in terms of who is applying and how they are. It's very early days in the process in terms of the use of the website and the online applications. And the government will be accountable for the appointments that they make and how representative they are as they proceed through the implementation of this new policy approach.
Very quickly, Mr. Area.
We are amending the Corporations Act requiring the public companies publicly submit a report identifying their board members, whether they are diverse enough. Do you intend to do that for the GIC appointments?
Mr. Chair, thank you. That is not, again, that would be a policy decision of the government. That is not something that I would be in a position to give you a view on.
Thank you, Ms. Sherman. We'll now move back to Mr. Weir.
Thank you. I'm wondering where a lack of appointments is actually slowing down these administrative processes, whether consideration has been given to the possibility of appointing tribunal members on an interim basis?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chair. That is part of the government's approach in terms of implementing the policy to make use of what we've referred to as transitional measures. So where there may be a selection process underway and a vacancy that is critical in terms of the continuing business of government, there would certainly be consideration given by the government to putting in place someone for a shorter term period and not putting them through the selection process. Sometimes those are reappointments of existing members whose terms expire, and those are short term, less than a year or up to a year, and subject to any legislative provisions. Sometimes there will be legislative provisions that require an appointment to be for a certain period of time. It may only be made for 3 years, in which case, the government would have to, we couldn't do it for 1 year, we would have to do it for a 3-year period.
So in terms of the specific panels where the auditor has identified problems resulting from the lack of appointments, was the reason for that there was a legislative barrier to appointing people on an interim basis, or why wasn't that tool used?
Mr. Chair, thank you. The one thing I should clarify is that the period of the audit, which was 2010 to 2015, was a different process in place, and so the transitional appointments were not. That is something that this government has put in place through the implementation of the new policy approach. But at any point in time, in managing the appointments to a tribunal, the minister would have the option of looking at temporary appointments if that was needed.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. In terms of the competition tribunal, what were the specific problems there in terms of appointing enough members?
Mr. Chair, I'll ask my colleague from industry to respond.
Ms. Dewar.
Hi there.
Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that first of all, I'd like to say that ISET agrees with the recommendations of the Auditor General. We wholeheartedly are taking them into action, and we're helping implement the framework. With respect to the Competition Tribunal, I think it's important to know that the legislation calls for a set number of judicial and lay members, up to a maximum of. It doesn't mean they all have to be in place all the time, because it really depends on workload. So I would say a couple of things. As far as I know, and I've only been in my position since December of 2015, to the best of my knowledge, the tribunal was able to deal with their workload. I think the one thing that might be missing from the dialogue today is one of the important things that PCO has put in place when we look at these new processes for lay members is that we're allowed to do larger competitive processes and establish pools of candidates and to draw from that pool over a period of time, which really allows us far more flexibility when we're speaking about a need that could arise quickly because the workload changes and we already have a qualified group of people. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
We'll move back to Ms. Hutchings, and welcome to our committee.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here, filling in for my colleague. My question is for you, Ms. Sherman. Regarding the online portal where potential applicants apply, they go in and they get their profile. I have a few questions. Are they notified once their profile is set up? And do they have, if they don't hear that they've been, I guess they'll know eventually if they were qualified or accepted or not. Do they get a notification when there are new positions? So if it was someone that was interested in an Indigenous position or agriculture, do they get an information that there are new positions available, or do they have to reapply every time?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There are two things on the profile. So you first have to register and create your user profile, and in that process, a person will get confirmation that they are registered on the website. Once they have their registration and they apply for specific positions, they will upload their documents and have confirmation of that. And then they will be notified that a process they will be contacted, should there be further steps in terms of they will be selected for an interview or that kind of, that next step. We do not right now have the capability on the website to send automatic messages to people about other positions they might be interested in. But when they do apply for a specific position, we will often, in the notice of opportunity, there will be a flag there that if they may be considered for other similar positions. So we do have a process we're working out in order to make sure, as my colleague mentioned about creating a roster specific to one entity, we are also working to see if we can, if people are qualified, but perhaps there may be a similar position that they may be interested in, that we would be able to consider them for that too.
Okay. I'm from a rural riding, as many as my colleagues in the House. We hear often how connectivity and broadband is an issue. So if now the main place to apply is online, do you think that's going to have an impediment to people applying from rural ridings? We want to make sure that we have our country represented from coast to coast to coast on all tribunals and boards.
Absolutely. Mr. Chair. Thank
Ms.
you.
Sherman.
Okay. I don't think so. I think that we are certainly sensitive to some of those issues. We have tried to, and I'm not the expert on all the technicalities, but we have tried to make the system work with a minimum amount of space required in terms of loading particular documents. I think that we do have some experience that we've seen. We also support the Independent Advisory Board for Senate appointments, where we had a 4-week period for applications and lots of traffic on that website, and we're able to service people from all across the provinces that were affected. So we haven't seen any difficulties yet.
And seeing as it is 2016, do you use many forms of social media? I know if I want to get the word out of my riding, I use Facebook. Facebook seems to be the thing, and have you given consideration to do that type of social media awareness?
Thank you. We are working on that. We don't have a broadly based approach for that, but certainly in terms of individual notices of opportunity, where we are working, we may have a specific recruitment strategy or advertising strategy that would involve social media. So yes, those are things we're certainly hoping to make use of.
Okay, thank you.
All right, you have a little time left. Maybe I'll give it to, it is your party's time. I'll give it to someone on this side. Mr. Area. Oh, I'm sorry, Shannon. Go ahead, Brenda. We'll come back to you as well.
All right. Thank you very much, Chair. Actually, I want to come back just to the Auditor General's point around, what is the real problem here in expediting the filling of vacant positions, and it seems to be around that succession planning and forward thinking. So I would like to hear from each of the department representatives here today what your department is doing now to identify vacancies before they come up, the succession planning, and how are you supporting that?
Ms. Sherman.
I can give a brief perspective in terms of how we are working with departments to that end. We certainly do track and monitor vacancies across the Governor and Council appointment population, and share information with departments in terms of their ministers' portfolio and upcoming vacancies. And having that information enables the departments to work in terms of, the resources and the allocation of their time to those processes. I don't know if my colleagues would like to add to.
Yeah, so over at INAC, we have a small unit whose main purpose is to review all of the appointments that our minister makes a recommendation to the Governor and Council. And so those are the things that we look out for to see what's coming down. We're speaking with the different sectors as well, who knows very well the boards and organizations, and to identify if there are unexpected deaths, for example. So we monitor that, and we have that special unit that checks that and makes sure that we're there and able to identify any vacancies and the like.
Anyone else, Mr. Sintrat?
Thank you. Public Safety Canada, we also track vacancies very closely and keep an eye on upcoming vacancies, provide that information to the Minister's Office and to the organizations with whom we work in the portfolio. We also, to the extent possible, try to work ahead of any vacancies in terms of preparing the support material and documentation that the minister requires to be able to make a decision in the end.
Thank you. And Ms. Dewar, I see the light is on there.
Well, I would say, first of all, we have a dedicated team that track these very closely. But I would say in my 30 years as a public servant, the engagement and training that PCO has undertaken on this initiative is unprecedented. We have weekly calls, and beyond that, many follow-ups. So I think they are, in their own gentle way, forcing us to ensure that we have processes in place to help us manage not only the workload, but to ensure that we have vacancies that are coming up due and that we are dealing with them on a nature.
Thank you. That is good news. That's good to hear. And congratulations for your, what'd you call it, peaceful ways? Okay. Ms. McColman. Gentle ways. All right. Mr. McColman, please. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to deal with the succession issue, and I guess from a background of owning a building company, I think of things in terms of blueprints and of step 1, step 2, step 3. And I'm just wondering to any of you, I suppose, perhaps maybe the Auditor General could begin. I tend to view my time here as being observing that there's a lot of political influence here. If that's the elephant in the room, that's what it is, in my view, which is when it gets to the political level, in many cases, these are patronage appointments. These are people that eat, drink, and breathe the same ideology that the current government of the day does. Maybe I'm dead wrong, and we're trying in a way to be correct about making sure that they've got the skill set that's required. Don't get me wrong in the sense that incompetent individuals would be appointed, but I really want to get candid, if I can, with you. And again, use your own discretion in whether you want to answer or not answer. But in your experience over time at this, and considering that it seems to me that perhaps a better approach from that step-by-step process would be putting time limits on ministerial staff and ministers to make decisions and getting people in place on a timely basis, because that's one of the major criticisms. You know, I have anecdotal personal knowledge of someone who was trying to find out whether he would be reappointed and kept saying, I need to know to plan my life, and spent an extra year and then was suddenly finding himself without, not being told. So I'm not going to bring up names or situations or anything like that, but that's the reality. I know the situation. So that's kind of a broad thing to state, but what are the realities? What are the political realities here? And I'm not expecting overnight change in any particular government not wanting to have control politically about these appointments. But what are the realities that could make it better from your point of view that you could share with us, that if there were a step-by-step, if the minister had a deadline that they had to decide by, would that help?
I don't want to cut into Mr. McColman's question, but I will just say, like in one of the paragraphs that you said, and I think this builds on what Mr. McColman has said. For example, it is also worth noting that during the implementation of the new process, the government has decided to make appointments or reappointments to positions that are essential for the good governance or continuity of government business that may not include the full set of new measures that we had just announced in this year. So when we read something like that, it might be easy to say, okay, here's the new process. We have the process, but the government, because they want continuance of government policy and continuity of government business, they're just going to appoint whoever. Is that fair?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that my point in putting forward the government's approach to the reappointments on a transitional basis is really that, and many of them are reappointments of incumbents, people who are in the position and they are extending their term. So I'm not in a position to say that is political influence. I think that is an incumbent whose term is being extended in order to have a selection process that will meet the requirements of the open and transparent and merit-based process. So it really is a transition in terms of getting to the fully the full selection process that I outlined, which does take some time, both in terms of advertising, managing a selection process, and vetting and considering candidates, and then, of course, providing advice to the minister. That does take a certain amount of time. We do, as I mentioned, in a project planning sense, have timelines and ideas about how long that takes, which is part of the information that we work with among the network of departments that support ministers. And so there is a good understanding about the time frame that is involved. And in order to ensure continuity, where terms may have been expiring, in February or March or June, the government did take an approach of reappointing or making some temporary appointments. So I wouldn't take that as, sort of an end run on the process that has been announced. It is definitely a transitional approach. And then timelines, there are some inherent timelines in terms of how the process works. Ministers are wanting to manage their vacancies and make sure that the organizations they are responsible for have, the appointments and the people in place to carry out the mandate that they are accountable for. So I think within the system, there are some timelines that are clearly in place, and our job in the public service is to back it up from those timelines and make sure that we can support their recommendations to the Governing Council with a sound process.
Thank you, Ms. Sherman. Monsieur Lefebvre.
Merci,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Danduvan, earlier you said that you work with a team within Aboriginal Affairs. You make recommendations to the minister. Is that true for tribunal positions that come under your department? Mr. Chair, I didn't understand your question. Earlier, you talked about your role, about the recommendations that you made with respect to candidates and tribunal positions. Maybe I misspoke. My team, just as is the case with other departments, we're there to support the minister in our case, and we work closely with the PCO in order to support the new process. When I talked about the team, our role is to look at any openings that are there and to make sure we know what's going on. Is that the case for other teams? we've been doing this for a few months. I go back to my initial point, and I will repeat. My question is simple. Between 2010, during the audit period, between 2010 and November 2015, did your department or the PCO receive or recommend a candidate or candidates for the specific claims tribunal to anyone whomsoever? I wasn't there for this period in time, so if I understood your question properly, as my colleague said earlier, in the department, because of the work that we do within the department and the work done by the tribunal, we have to ensure that there's some distance there. And as far as appointments are concerned to the tribunal, the GIC appointments, and then we're not involved in that process at all. And in conversations with the Auditor General, we underscored this point. Well, who makes the recommendation? Who? I want to know. That's my question. Canadians should be able to have confidence in the system. There's been 3 years that appointments have been made. We have trouble. We have problems with unacceptable delays, and we don't know who to deal with. It's a simple question, please.
Makes the recommendations to the GIC.
Somebody tells the minister recommendations.
And because it is a judge that is required, there is a separate and distinct process that happens with the Department of Justice, with the judiciary, and the chief justices in the provinces of those superior courts. I cannot speak to what those activities were during the audit period.
Why not?
Because they are not within my responsibility. That is the management of judges. What we do is, exactly as you pointed out, the department will be cognizant of what the tribunal may be looking for in terms of the demands. The Department of Justice would be working with the judiciary in terms of judges that may be available. I don't know what is involved in those discussions, but that is the process by which it goes through.
I just find it odd that we just, Mr. Dan Duven just mentioned to us a bit earlier as well that there was three people named to this tribunal in the month of May, right? Am I correct? And for 3 years there was none. I'm just asking why. And again, nobody can provide me an answer. And I just don't find it acceptable for the Canadian public and our First Nations that want the claims to proceed, that have been delayed for years, decades in some cases, to knowing that their cases cannot even be heard, and nobody here on this panel can tell me why. I just find that, Mr. Chair, unacceptable.
Noted. All right. We'll go to Mr. Gaudin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have the privilege to go back to the question that I asked initially. Some witnesses who haven't had an opportunity to express themselves will have an opportunity to do so. So I'd like each of the departments to talk about their self-assessment tool, because perhaps if we go by the lottery with the Auditor General's part, you'll have to wait 10 years for changes. We have to have a public service that is functional, that assesses itself to improve the system, so that there's some rigor involved. So I'd like to know if there is some self-assessment to improve the process without having to wait for a visit from the Auditor General. Thank you.
I don't know if the question was clear. I think what the question was clear, but it was what are you doing within the departments, not so much just on self-assessment, but on recognizing the vacancies that may be coming, assessing when we need to act. So, I mean, you get your phone call from Ms. Sherman once a month or however saying, you know, these are the things happening. That's a good, you know, that's one extra measurement. But is each department getting that call? Or each department's putting out a benchmark of things that need to be done so that we don't have the vacancies and is that clear, fair, Mr. Godin?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to add the following. You understand that the client that your department serves is the Canadian taxpayer. So as a client, he or she wants adequate service. It doesn't make sense that people have to wait. Sometimes people are at the IRB, it was from 10 months now, you have to wait 18 months. I think the question's clear here. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. We have weekly calls. We are all learning the new system. So we're on a learning curve, and this applies to all the departments. I think my other colleagues will also say this as well. As public servants, we are all aware that we work for Canadians. So we do assess the work, evaluate the work we do to ensure that it's done properly, bearing in mind the needs of Canadians. Our unit, which is responsible for appointments, we always look at the work we do to ensure that we are working effectively. And when the Auditor General did an audit at the department and looked at the tribunal, we reassessed our process to make sure that this independence that we respect, here we refer to the independence of the tribunal, on our side, we didn't want to be accused of meddling with respect to the appointments made by the GIC or the...
Want to comment?
En fait, ce que je voudrais savoir...
I really want to know is today's audit pertains to 2009 to 2015. During this time, unfortunately, in your case, you weren't even there, but in the other departments, were there any mechanisms, any self-evaluation mechanisms? This could be done 3 years, yearly, whatever, in order to improve the system.
Yes? Other departments.
Other
I
departments,
see your
yeah.
light is on. We'll go back to Mr. Sintrat.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At our department, we don't have a system per se for this particular file. We have a broader system, but we did set up, starting in the spring, which coincides with the tabling of the Auditor General's report and the new policy of the Privy Council, we set up internally a one-stop shop service where my office looks at the portfolio for the department and the PCO. So all the information goes through my office. So I always can tell where we are with a particular file. We deal directly with the PCO to inform them about vacancies that are going to be occurring in the future. So we can look at various options for the appointment process. When this is necessary, we know 6 months, 12 months ahead of time which position will be coming vacant, and then we start our bureaucratic process because that's our role as public servants. We give the minister the ability to manage this whole process.
That wanted to wade in? No? We'll then move to Mr. Weir, please.
Just to return to the competition tribunal, It seemed that Ms. Doer was making the point that there's a maximum number of appointees that need not be met at all times, and there's a roster of other qualified people who could be appointed. By contrast, my reading of the Auditor General's report was that there was a real concern that a lack of appointees was delaying hearings that were very important to Canadian businesses and consumers. So I'm just wondering if I can get the Auditor General to kind of come back on this question.
Mr. Chair, it brings me back to the fundamental point. I mean, we can look at vacancies and we can look at processes, but the real measure that matters is the timeliness of decisions. So we identified here that there was one lay member, that it took 16 months to appoint an individual with expertise in economics, needed to hear cases before the tribunal at the time. So, if you need that type of expertise and you don't have it, it doesn't matter if you're only one member below, your maximum number. You may be well above your quorum and that type of thing, but if you are missing a key competency, then it can affect the ability to make decisions. So, again, the key measure on all of these things is whether these organizations are able to make the decisions on a timely basis. If they're not, is the reason for that because they don't have the number of members, or maybe the reason is something else? But, in this case, we were able to see that with the number of shortages that we identified, that it seemed to be having an impact on the actual decision-making of some of these organizations.
Thank you. Now, a more general question. We've been talking about the appointment process, but we haven't really talked about the orientation or training that might be available to people after they're appointed to these tribunals. And I wonder if there's anyone on the panel that would like to speak to that question.
Mr. Chair, I can start. Thank you. Yes, there are, and the Auditor General did look at some of the training and orientation that we do. There's certain information that is provided through the fact that the appointees are now public office holders, and if they are in what we would refer to as leadership positions, we do meet with them and inform them of those responsibilities. We also, for the role of PCO, we attend other orientation and information sessions that are managed for various groups of appointees and provide information and training about their broader responsibilities. The organizations themselves will provide more specific and, the job-specific training and orientation to their responsibilities. Some of my colleagues might want to comment on what that is. But we do work to make sure that, first of all, they understand their responsibilities, in terms of their public appointment status, and then the more specific training is usually done with onboarding processes within the organizations.
I can say a few words about the Parole Board of Canada, who's under the umbrella of public safety. They have a very well-established training and onboarding program for their members and their membership, and I believe they also have an annual assessment of them. That's what I can say about the board.
And to the Auditor General, are you more or less satisfied with the orientation and training that's in place? Do you have any suggestions on that front, or is it something you might examine in the future?
Well, I think we identified, that the Privy Council office was offering one-on-one sessions to newly appointed chairs, and there were a number of different types of that. We also, though, in paragraph 71, talked about the work of the Canada School of Public Service and identifying that a lot of what they offer is non-mandatory, but it was a bit concerning that only 13 out of the 37 chairs, although 7 of them may not have had the opportunity, so if we assume they did, it still would have only been 20 out of 37 chairs, so 17 that didn't participate in some of that. And I think it's very important to understand where some of these people perhaps are coming from. So if they're people that have never had any contact with government in the past, and are now coming to work in a government environment. You know, things are different in government. There are different things that you can and can't do when you're working in a government environment, different things that you need to pay attention to. So, you know, I think that it would be cause for concern to think that only about half the chairs coming into roles would be taking advantage of those types of training sessions. So, you know, I think it's just an indicator that there's still probably a little bit more work that needs to be done on this front to make sure that people are well oriented to what they are coming into.
We're a good question. We'll come back to Ms. Mendez.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank all of you for coming here. You've given us more details about how your department works and about the vacancies that you need to staff. I think what really strikes me, and I think my colleague to my right has noted this, we have seen years go by where there was some laissez-faire when it came to the appointment process. And this fault lies with the people who were supposed to appoint people. If possible, we don't necessarily have action plans. But we have 3 tribunals, and hats off to public security. I think that you were exemplary in the way that you operated, but it would be possible to have from your departments a letter. We could make a formal request through the committee. Could we have a progress report about how things have changed since the new process has been implemented in February? You could tell us whether you've seen an improvement in the whole appointment process. That would be my request, therefore, that we have some type of progress report from each of the departments and each of the tribunals, particularly IRB, specific claims, and the competition board. And you could take a pass, Mr. Centra.
Go to Mr. McColman now, please. Or, right.
Specific question to Mr. Santrat. On the National Parole Board, how many vacancies currently exist on that board?
19.
19 vacancies. Out of how many total positions?
89.
89. Okay. Is the cohort that is there, are they capable of keeping up with the requirements of the numbers of people requesting hearings and such? Or does the 19 vacancies mean that there are deficiencies in terms of hearings?
I would, Mr. Chair, I would respectfully refer that question to the board. I'm not in a position to say whether or not this has an impact on their operations. I can say, though, that we have, the government has recently launched a selection process to fill positions of members in the board, just recently in October. And government has also proceeded with the transitional appointments of 5 members over the last few weeks to help with the workload.
Okay, thank you.
I don't have any other questions here, but I would just kind of like to take the chair's prerogative on that. I think our Auditor General brought out I think it was him that brought out an interesting scenario that if you are seeking someone with a strong economic background and there's just no one in the pool for that particular position, then you're going to have a vacancy. I think we should have confidence. There should be a certain level of confidence there. If we've recruited well, if we've done all the things that we think we've done, and there's still, for some reason, not quite the threshold of merit that we would like to see, we don't have it. I guess the other thing is there's a lot of people in our constituency across the country who always come to members of parliament and ask, you know, what is it, how do you get on one of these boards? How do you get on these boards? And typically we tell them to go to the website and look and apply. And so I'm not certain how many do. You know, I mean, you know, it's like sitting at the coffee shop back home. Everyone is an expert, you know, and can do the job, they're sure, probably better than the bureaucrats that are there now. But if they apply, that's good. Do they just not get put into the pool of, do they get told that they're no longer being considered, or is it just into this limbo out there where they're sitting by the phone waiting because they know government wants their expertise, but maybe you're just saying, well, you know what, we don't have that expertise in this group right now. Ms. Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There is a process in terms of applicants are advised when an appointment is made and that process is over. So they would be aware at that point that they were not being considered for that particular position. So we do try to close the loop on that. I think that there are often, if a process takes a certain amount of time, people may have, you know, they may be wondering what's going on, and we're looking at ways of, you know, updating people in terms of where their application may be at. The website does allow them to, you know, write and ask about various processes that they may have applied for, and they would be told that the process is still ongoing, or that they should have received an email, for example, that the process is complete.
All right. Back to the Parole Board of Canada. It sounds like 89 positions, 19 are vacant. But the Parole Board of Canada, it's not just like an open pool of 89. There are some very specific regions that you seek. For example, you would seek someone to sit on the parole board in the Western region, in British Columbia region, in the Prairie region, in the Atlantic region. Is there any one region right now that is, you know, where the significant, where, you know, it's very obvious that the significant amount of openings are, you know, just specific to one region?
I'd have to look at the statistics specifically. I believe the Quebec region is the only one with a full contingency of appointments, and the rest are scattered across the country.
All right, so it's not like there is one region that has 12 openings or 10 openings and then just a sprinkling across the rest of the country. It's fairly equal?
That's correct.
All right, good. Mr. McColman, and then we will close.
Further to that, another number that I'm wondering if you could provide it, if you don't know it off the top of your head, sir, and that is the number of applications that you have currently in the queue for positions on the National Parole Board.
441. 441.
41. And of those 441, and we can't find 19 for some reason, but of those 441, how many have qualified and are through to the point of being recommended to the ministry?
We're just at the point that looking at the applications right now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for coming today, and in the course of the rest of the day, or perhaps over the next few days, if all of a sudden you feel like you have more information that you would like to share with our committee, we would encourage you to do that, to submit it to our clerk. If you think you answered a question you should have or could have answered it a little better, please feel free to send that in as well. It would help us as we study this and help understand a little bit the appointment process. Thank you for coming and helping us to understand better. Thank you, committee. We're now adjourned.